This video is brought to you by John Robson Guitar Tuition. If you enjoy the content, please consider supporting the channel by enrolling on a course, purchasing some guitar lessons or a t-shirt, or you can join my Patreon. Now, on with the show. Hello chaps, welcome once again to John Robson Guitar Tuition. As always, and especially at the moment, I do hope you're well. So, do you like the new intro then? That little caricature of me was done by a very, very talented and kind viewer to this channel, a guy called Pete, who is a caricature artist. And if you're interested in checking out his work, I've linked down below to his Facebook page where you can get in touch with him and maybe, kind of commission some work off him or, kind of admire his talent. He basically he's a viewer of the channel and he said, like what you're doing, I've done this, I hope you like it. And of course I do. And I like it so much that with Pete's blessing, it is now available on a t-shirt. There it is, and if you want to own one of these t-shirts, you're also helping out Zoe's Place. All of the proceeds that I receive from the sales of that t-shirt will go to Zoe's Place. Obviously, Teespring is still going to be taking their cut from the sale of the shirts. But any monies I receive that come to me from the sale of those shirts going to Zoe's Place Baby Hospice. So you're helping out a good cause if you grab yourself one of those shirts. So, what are we talking about today then? Well, I thought I'd do a video on bands that have survived lineup changes and not only survived the change of lineup, but gone on to perhaps prosper and fulfill their potential from the change of lineup. So, let's have a look at them. Here's the first one.
The Rolling Stones.
Yes, indeed, the Strolling Bones. Now, I think that the early years, the Brian Jones era, there was some great music that came out of the band during those years. I mean, Little Red Rooster, probably my favourite track from those years, and, Satisfaction, Jumpin' Jack Flash, great, all great tunes, but the sound that I have in my head that when I think of the Rolling Stones is very much the Mick Taylor era of the Stones. I think he made his first appearance on the Let It Bleed album. I think he was on a few tracks on that album, but then Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street, Goat's Head Soup, and It's Only Rock and Roll. That for me was when the Stones perfected that recipe that we think of as the Rolling Stones sound, and that is what they continue to work from these days, and from then on in. I mean, you take a song that's kind of well into the Ronnie Wood era of the band, Start Me Up. That sounds like it could have been written during the Mick Taylor era. It's got that sort of, that classic Stones sound to it that they absolutely nailed during the Mick Taylor years. So yeah, I would say that not only did they survive the departure and very sad demise of Brian Jones, but with the arrival of Mick Taylor, that's a lineup change that actually they prospered from. So there you go. Next.
Pink Floyd.
Yes, now I'm probably going to get some stick for this one, I know that, but the early Pink Floyd stuff, like Piper at the Gates of Dawn and, See Emily Play, Arnold Lane, all of that kind of, let's call it the Syd Barrett era, because that's what I'm referring to. It's just all a bit wishy-washy, flower power, meh, as far as I'm concerned. I don't listen to it. I've heard it and it never really inspired me to want to hear it again. It was the arrival for me of David Gilmour in the band. And yes, I know that there is overlap, or there was overlap between, Barrett and Gilmour, but it's the arrival of David Gilmour as a creative force in the band, really, as he's finding his feet and kind of establishing himself as a writer in the band, and, before it all became essentially the Roger Waters project. That period, from say Medal through to The Wall, that is for me the classic classic Pink Floyd sound. It's when they absolutely nailed that recipe again. It's when their sound crystallized and became, when you think of the Pink Floyd sound, that is the era that you think of, and that classic Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, fantastic era for the band. And there's a rising trajectory up to about the Wall, and then maybe the final cut is when things all start to go a little bit not so good. But yeah, I mean, not only did they survive the loss of the main creative force in the band, Syd Barrett, but for me, that was the period when they prospered. After that, that's when they became the band that we think of today as Pink Floyd. So there you go. Next.
Deep Purple.
Yes, I know, potentially another controversial one here. Ritchie Blackmore. Yes, he finally walked out of the band in 94, didn't he? Or was fired, or depends who you believe, I suppose. And I think many people, and I got to tell you, myself included, wrote the band off then and thought, right, that's it. They're probably all just going to go off and do solo projects, and, the best years of Purple are behind them. And how wrong was I? Here's the thing. I don't want to decry Ritchie's contribution to the band. And, you take a song like Highway Star, for example. Would that song be anything like the song it is without that, Blackmore guitar solo? Of course it wouldn't. It's an epic guitar solo that elevates the whole song to epic proportions. But here's the thing. As well as making a song, I always felt that Ritchie's guitar playing could ruin a song as well. And if you want evidence of that, take a listen to Knocking at Your Back Door from the Perfect Strangers album. It should be a classic Purple tune. It's got a fantastic riff, and you've got a fantastic guitar tone on that riff, locked in with John Lord's Hammond organ sound. Everything is in place for what could be a classic Purple tune. And then you get to the solo. And oh dear, it's just a cacophony of, unmusical banshee noise, if you want my honest opinion. It is awful. And, then when Steve Morse comes in, and I know that, there are many people out there, diehard Blackmore fans, who regard Steve Morse as still, more than a quarter of a century later, as nothing more than an imposter. But, they've produced, I think, more consistently good music in the Steve Morse era than they did in the Ritchie Blackmore era. Yes, some of Purple's best moments are during the Ritchie Blackmore era. But if we're talking about consistency here, I think you've got to hand it to Steve Morse. The other thing is, that sort of personal friction that goes on in a band, that was obviously there when Ritchie was around. That can be, the kind of the spark, the one-upmanship that makes people raise their game to kind of make a point, and, it sparks the creativity. But it can also be a destructive force in the long term, I think. And if you want evidence of that, take a listen to the Nobody's Perfect album, which was the live album that they did after the 80s reunion. And you can tell it's a band who aren't getting on and who aren't creatively enjoying each other's company and enjoying the music that they're making, and the music suffers as a result. And then take a listen to the Live at the Olympia 96 album with Steve Morse, and I can't listen to that album without ending up with a big, huge, silly grin on my face, because the good mood of the musicians and the music that they're making is infectious. So I would say that not only did Deep Purple survive the loss of Ritchie Blackmore, they went on to prosper. Next.
John Mayall's Blues Breakers.
Yes, now if you think of John Mayall's Blues Breakers, chances are you're going to think of this album, the Beano album, the one with Eric Clapton, basically. And when Eric left the band, even John Mayall has gone on record as saying he thought that could have been a big, big disaster. It could have been the band on the skids, because, Eric was the star of the show. You know, the whole Clapton is God graffiti that his period in the band spawned. But I'm going to just play devil's advocate here. I think Eric hadn't fully matured as a blues guitarist at that point. I think he was still learning his craft, and fantastic album though that is, I think Eric's blues playing on the Layla sessions really is the zenith of his powers. He's played as good as that over the years, but I don't think he's ever bettered the playing that he did on that Layla album. And I think he was still on his way towards that when he was with John Mayall. However, the album which came after the Beano album, A Hard Road, with Peter Green on the guitar, I think Peter is at the peak of his powers on that album. And again, like Eric on the Layla album, he played as good as that, you know, in subsequent years, but he never played better than that. And, you know, take a track like The Supernatural, for example, or, you know, Someday After a While, or The Stumble, or You Don't Love Me, all fantastic tracks, and they all stand up to be, I think, equally as good, if not better, than the selection of tunes from the Beano album. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that if I had to pick my favourite John Mayall and the Blues Breakers album, it would be A Hard Road rather than the Beano album. So, you know, that's another example of a band that had a potentially disastrous lineup change, and not only did they survive, but they actually prospered. Next.
Thin Lizzy.
Okay, now this band are perhaps the ones on this list who've had the most number of lineup changes to survive. You know, I mean, the early years, the Eric Bell period, you know, I mean, I've got Shades of a Blue Orphanage and Vagabonds of the Western World, and occasionally I listen to them, but they aren't what I think of as being, you know, classic Thin Lizzy. I think they were still kind of experimenting and finding their way at that point. It's only really with the arrival of Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson and that whole kind of twin lead guitar kind of thing that I think we really settle on what is the classic Thin Lizzy sound. And if you look at the guitarists that sort of came in and out the door then, Gary Moore was in, then out, and then in, and however many times he kind of joined and left. And, you know, Brian Robertson and, you know, Snowy White and Midge Ewer at one point as well. And yet that recipe that they'd settled on, the sound that they'd created as the Thin Lizzy sound, actually, you know, it survived that. And, you know, I think every album that they released, and later John Sykes, of course, on the Thunder and Lightning album, you know, I think every album that they released during that sort of post-Eric Bell period, once they'd kind of settled on that, if you want to be uncharitable and call it a formula, or, you know, kind of being charitable and calling it a winning recipe, once they'd settled on that, it just seemed to always work. And, you know, the lineup changes didn't seem to interfere with that. So I guess in a way, this is a prime example of a band who not only survived a lineup change, but went on to prosper. So there you go, folks. Those are my choices of bands who not only survived changes of lineup, but went on to, you know, kind of prosper from them, perhaps. If you've got any ones that you think I've missed, or, you know, if you disagree with any of my choices, I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments section below. That's what it's for, after all. And before we go, I just want to kind of mention that in the live stream last Friday, I was talking about the jewellery that my very talented missus makes. Well, if you want to check it out, link in the description below to her online shop. And I think, well, I hope you'll agree with me that, in my unbiased opinion, that she's a very talented lady indeed. She's got good taste as well. Look what she married. What else? Yes, the Friday live stream, 5 p.m. UK time. We kicked the weekend off with, you know, a bit of a kind of chin wag and a beer and a bit of banter, and it's great fun, a great way to kick off the weekend. And don't forget that if you're thinking of pulling the trigger on a Fret Zealot tuition device, then you can get one a little bit cheaper by using the discount code you can see on screen right now. And don't forget the t-shirts, and that's pretty much it for today, folks. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Hope you found it useful in some way, don't know how, but informative, maybe entertaining or whatever. And if you have, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I'll see you all next time around. Stay well, folks, stay safe, and above all, stay sane. Bye for now.